Priyanka Chopra keeps her composure, but Whoopi Goldberg's unexpected reaction changes everything in seconds. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, shifting from a friendly exchange into a moment that feels noticeably more serious? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins the way many daytime interviews do, with a warm welcome on The View as the hosts introduce Priyanka Chopra to the table. The tone is relaxed, almost conversational, with the panel smiling and the audience offering a steady round of applause. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at the center, leans slightly forward as she often does, setting the pace for the discussion. At first, the conversation stays comfortably within familiar territory. They talk about Priyanka's recent projects, her international career, and how she balances work between Hollywood and her global commitments. The mood is light, with occasional laughter from the audience as one of the co-hosts makes a playful comment about how busy her schedule must be. Priyanka responds with a composed smile, speaking clearly and thoughtfully, her tone measured but friendly. As the discussion continues, Whoopi shifts the focus slightly. Her expression becomes more inquisitive, not confrontational, but direct in a way that signals a deeper question is coming. She brings up the broader topic of representation in media, particularly how actors from different cultural backgrounds are perceived and treated in mainstream American entertainment. It's a natural transition, one that fits the format of the show, but it subtly changes the energy at the table. Priyanka listens closely, maintaining eye contact, her posture upright. She nods occasionally, acknowledging the direction of the conversation. Whoopi frames her question carefully, asking about the pressures that come with being seen as a representative of a culture rather than simply an individual performer. Her tone is calm, but there's a seriousness behind it that the audience seems to pick up on immediately. Priyanka begins her response in a thoughtful way, explaining that while representation can be a powerful opportunity, it also comes with expectations that aren't always fair. She speaks about wanting to be recognized for her work as an actor first, rather than being defined solely by her background. Her voice remains steady, and her delivery is articulate, reflecting the kind of answer that comes from experience rather than improvisation. As she continues, one of the co-hosts briefly interjects with a supportive comment, agreeing that audiences sometimes place unnecessary labels on performers. The moment feels collaborative again for a second, but Whoopi gently brings the focus back, asking a follow-up that adds a layer of complexity. She questions whether stepping into global roles also means accepting a certain level of responsibility to speak on cultural or political issues. There's a noticeable pause before Priyanka answers. It's not long, but it's enough for the audience to sense that the conversation is becoming more nuanced. Priyanka's expression shifts slightly, her smile softening into a more neutral, serious look. She chooses her words carefully, acknowledging that public figures often face expectations to speak out, but emphasizing that not every situation is as straightforward as it appears from the outside. Her response is calm, but there's a firmness in her tone now. She explains that while she respects the idea of using one's platform for awareness, she also believes in being informed and intentional about what she speaks on. The audience remains quiet, listening closely, and the usual background murmurs of agreement are noticeably absent, replaced by focused attention. Whoopi listens without interruption, her face composed but attentive. When Priyanka finishes, she responds by offering a perspective that reflects her own experience in the industry. She points out that audiences sometimes look to public figures for guidance, especially during moments of cultural or social tension. Her delivery is measured, not critical, but it introduces a subtle contrast in viewpoints. At this point, the conversation begins to take on a slightly more serious tone. It's not heated, but it's clearly more than just a casual exchange. Priyanka leans forward slightly, signaling engagement, and responds by clarifying her earlier point. She reiterates that while she understands the expectations, she also believes in the importance of personal boundaries and the right to choose when and how to engage with certain topics. The back and forth remains respectful, but the difference in perspective becomes more apparent. One of the other co-hosts steps in briefly, attempting to bridge the two viewpoints by suggesting that there might be a balance between responsibility and personal choice. The comment helps ease the tension slightly, and there's a small ripple of agreement from the audience. However, Whoopi follows up again, not in a confrontational way, but with a level of directness that brings the conversation back into focus. She asks whether staying neutral on certain issues can sometimes be interpreted as avoidance. The question lands with a quiet wait, and for a moment, the studio feels still. Priyanka takes a breath before responding. Her tone remains composed, but there's a noticeable seriousness in her expression now. She explains that neutrality is not always about avoidance, but sometimes about understanding complexity. She emphasizes that speaking without full context can do more harm than good, and that she prefers to engage in ways that are thoughtful and constructive rather than reactive. The audience listens closely, and a few nods can be seen among them. The exchange doesn't escalate into conflict, but it carries a level of intensity that stands out compared to the earlier part of the segment. It's the kind of moment that feels real, unscripted, and reflective of genuine perspectives rather than rehearsed talking points. As the discussion continues, the hosts begin to slightly adjust the tone, with one of them offering a lighter comment to ease the atmosphere. There's a brief moment of shared laughter, not dismissive, but enough to release some of the tension that had built up. Priyanka smiles again, though her expression still carries a hint of the seriousness from the exchange. Whoopi also softens her tone, acknowledging Priyanka's perspective and thanking her for her honesty. It's a subtle shift, but an important one, signaling that while the conversation touched on differing viewpoints, it remains grounded in mutual respect. The segment moves forward, but the energy has clearly changed from where it began. What started as a routine interview has evolved into a thoughtful discussion, one that reflects the kind of real-time, unscripted dialogue that daytime television occasionally captures. The audience seems more engaged now, listening not just for entertainment, but for insight. And as the conversation continues to unfold, it becomes clear that this moment, calm, serious, and grounded, is exactly what keeps viewers watching, waiting to see how both sides continue to navigate the discussion in real time. As the conversation continues, the shift in tone from earlier becomes more noticeable, not because anyone has raised their voice or become confrontational, but because both Priyanka Chopra and Whoopi Goldberg are now fully engaged in a discussion that carries more weight than a typical promotional interview. The rest of the panel on The View seems aware of it too, sitting slightly more attentive, watching closely rather than jumping in as frequently as before. There's a brief moment where one of the co-hosts offers a transition, referencing how conversations like this often come up when discussing global careers. It's an attempt to keep things flowing naturally, but it also gives Priyanka a chance to expand on what she had just said. She takes that opening calmly, her tone steady, explaining that navigating multiple industries has required her to constantly adapt, not just professionally, but culturally as well. She speaks about the differences in audience expectations between regions, noting that what might be considered a neutral stance in one place can be interpreted very differently somewhere else. As she explains this, her body language remains composed, hands lightly resting together, shoulders relaxed. But her eye contact is deliberate, particularly when she glances back toward Whoopi, signaling that she is addressing the earlier point directly. The audience listens quietly, and there's a sense that people are processing what's being said rather than reacting immediately. This is where the rhythm of the conversation slows down slightly, giving each response more space to land. Whoopi responds by acknowledging that perspective, nodding once before speaking. She doesn't dismiss what Priyanka is saying, but she reframes the discussion in a broader context. She points out that public figures, especially those with international influence, often find themselves in positions where their silence or their voice carries equal weight. Her tone remains calm, but there's a firmness in how she phrases it, as if she's drawing from her own long experience in the public eye. There's no interruption here. Priyanka lets Whoopi finish completely before responding. That pause, that willingness to listen fully, keeps the conversation from feeling combative. When Priyanka does speak again, she slightly leans forward, her expression focused. She clarifies that she doesn't see it as silence versus speaking out, but rather as choosing meaningful engagement over constant commentary. She explains that there have been moments where she has spoken publicly on issues that matter to her, but she avoids doing so in a way that feels performative. The word itself stands out when she says it, not emphasized dramatically, but clearly enough that it shifts the tone again. One of the co-hosts reacts with a small nod, quietly agreeing, while another briefly adds that audiences today are very quick to judge both action and inaction. That comment brings a small murmur from the audience, a sign that the point resonates. Whoopi listens, her expression thoughtful. She then follows up with another question, slightly more specific this time. She asks whether there's ever concern that waiting to speak, or choosing not to speak immediately, might lead to missed opportunities to influence public understanding in real time. It's a careful question, but it adds another layer of tension, not sharp but present. The kind that builds when both sides are trying to articulate something nuanced without oversimplifying. Priyanka takes a brief pause again, this time glancing down for just a moment before looking back up. When she answers, her voice is still calm, but there's a subtle emphasis now, suggesting that she's drawing a line around her perspective. She explains that timing matters, but so does accuracy. She says that in her experience, reacting too quickly can sometimes lead to misinformation or statements that don't fully reflect the reality of a situation. She adds that she prefers to use her platform in ways that contribute constructively, even if that means speaking later rather than sooner. The audience remains attentive, and there's a noticeable stillness in the studio. It's not uncomfortable, but it's focused. This isn't the kind of exchange that invites applause after every sentence. It's the kind that people listen to carefully before deciding how they feel. At this point, one of the co-hosts steps in again, this time attempting to broaden the discussion slightly. She brings up how social media has changed expectations for public figures, noting that there's often pressure to respond immediately to trending topics. Her tone is lighter, but the point connects directly to what's being discussed. Priyanka acknowledges that with a small nod, adding that the speed of information today can make thoughtful responses more challenging. She mentions that while social media allows for direct communication, it also amplifies scrutiny, making every word subject to interpretation. Whoopi responds with a brief, reflective comment of her own, noting that this level of scrutiny isn't entirely new, but has certainly intensified. There's a slight shift in her tone here, less probing, more reflective, as she connects the current moment to her own experiences over the years. For a moment, the conversation feels more aligned again, with both perspectives overlapping rather than diverging. The tension that had been building doesn't disappear, but it softens, replaced by a sense of shared understanding, even if the viewpoints aren't identical. Then, as often happens in live discussions, another subtle shift occurs. One of the co-hosts asks Priyanka whether she ever feels that audiences expect her to represent not just herself, but an entire culture or community. It's a question that ties back to the earlier part of the conversation, but this time it's framed more personally. Priyanka's expression changes slightly again, her smile returning briefly before settling into a more neutral look. She answers honestly, saying that expectation does exist, and that it can be both an honor and a pressure. She explains that while she values the opportunity to bring visibility to her background, she also believes in the importance of individuality. As she speaks, Whoopi watches closely, not interrupting, but clearly engaged. When Priyanka finishes, Whoopi offers a short response, acknowledging the complexity of that position. She doesn't challenge it directly this time, but her expression suggests she's still considering the broader implications. The audience begins to respond a bit more here, with a light round of applause following Priyanka's comment. It's not overwhelming, but it signals appreciation for the honesty of her answer. The conversation continues in this steady, measured rhythm. No raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, but a clear sense that something meaningful is being explored. The hosts remain attentive, stepping in occasionally to guide the flow, but largely allowing the exchange between Priyanka and Whoopi to unfold naturally. And as the segment moves forward, it becomes increasingly clear that what started as a standard interview has evolved into something more layered. A discussion shaped not by conflict, but by differing perspectives, careful responses, and the kind of quiet tension that comes from trying to address complex issues in real time, in front of a live audience. As the conversation carries forward, there's a subtle but noticeable shift in how everyone at the table is engaging. The earlier back and forth between Priyanka Chopra and Whoopi Goldberg has now set the tone for the entire segment on The View. It's no longer just a guest interview. It feels more like a focused discussion, with each participant choosing their words more carefully and listening more closely than usual. One of the co-hosts gently re-enters the conversation, picking up on the idea of public expectations. She asks Priyanka whether she has ever felt misunderstood by audiences, particularly when her intentions don't align with how her actions are perceived. The question is framed in a supportive tone, but it introduces another layer of reflection. Priyanka nods slightly before answering, her expression thoughtful. She explains that misunderstanding is almost unavoidable when you operate on a global platform. She points out that different audiences bring different cultural contexts, and what may seem clear in one place can be interpreted very differently somewhere else. Her tone remains steady, but there's a quiet honesty in how she describes those experiences. As she continues, she gives an example in general terms, not referencing any specific incident, but describing how even well-intentioned statements can be taken out of context. She emphasizes that this is part of the reality of being in the public eye, and that she has learned to approach communication with more awareness over time. The audience listens closely, and there's a slight murmur of agreement at certain points, suggesting that her comments resonate beyond just the context of celebrity. It's one of those moments where the conversation feels relatable, even to those not in the spotlight. Whoopi responds after a brief pause, leaning slightly forward again. Her tone is measured, but there's a renewed sense of focus in her delivery. She acknowledges what Priyanka is saying, but then adds that part of being a public figure is accepting that level of interpretation, even when it feels unfair. She frames it not as a criticism, but as a reality that comes with influence. That response brings the discussion back to the core tension: responsibility versus personal choice. It's not a disagreement in the traditional sense, but it's clear that both perspectives are being tested in real time. Priyanka listens without interrupting, maintaining eye contact. When she replies, there's a slight shift in her tone, still calm, but a bit more direct. She agrees that interpretation is part of the role, but she draws a distinction between being open to interpretation and being defined by it. She explains that while she understands the expectations, she also believes in maintaining control over her own narrative. The phrasing stands out, not because it's confrontational, but because it's precise. It reflects a perspective that's been thought through, rather than formed in the moment. The audience remains quiet, attentive. One of the co-hosts reacts by briefly stepping in, noting that this balance is something many public figures struggle with. She adds that there's often no clear right answer, which helps diffuse any sense of opposition between the two main viewpoints. Her comment is met with a few nods around the table. Still, the conversation doesn't fully relax. Whoopi follows up again, this time shifting slightly from the abstract to the practical. She asks how Priyanka personally decides when to speak and when to stay quiet. The question is straightforward, but it requires a more personal answer. Priyanka takes a moment before responding, her hands coming together briefly as she considers her words. She explains that her decisions are usually based on a combination of understanding the issue, feeling personally connected to it, and believing that her voice can add something meaningful. She emphasizes that she doesn't want to contribute just for the sake of being heard. As she speaks, there's a noticeable steadiness in her voice, suggesting confidence in her approach. At the same time, her tone remains respectful, acknowledging that others may choose differently. The audience responds with a light round of applause at the end of her answer, not loud, but appreciative. It's one of the first clearer reactions since the conversation became more serious, signaling that her explanation has resonated. Whoopi nods in response, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, she doesn't immediately follow up, which creates a brief pause in the conversation. It's not uncomfortable, but it's noticeable, a moment where the discussion seems to settle before moving forward again. Then, instead of pressing further, Whoopi shifts slightly, offering a reflection of her own. She shares that throughout her career, she has often felt a responsibility to speak, even when it was difficult or unpopular. Her tone is calm, but there's a personal weight to what she's saying, as if she's drawing from real experience rather than making a general point. That shift changes the dynamic again. It's no longer just a question and answer exchange. It becomes a sharing of perspectives. Priyanka listens attentively, nodding once as Whoopi finishes. One of the co-hosts takes this opportunity to gently connect the two viewpoints, suggesting that both approaches, speaking often and speaking selectively, can have value depending on the situation. Her tone is balanced, and it helps bring a sense of equilibrium back to the table. The audience seems to respond positively to that, with a small ripple of applause. The tension that had been quietly building begins to ease, not because the differences have disappeared, but because they've been acknowledged openly. Priyanka adds a final thought to this part of the discussion, agreeing that there isn't a single correct approach. She emphasizes that what matters most is intention and impact, rather than frequency. Her tone softens slightly as she says this, and her expression reflects a willingness to find common ground. Whoopi responds with a brief nod and a small smile, signaling that she appreciates the perspective, even if the conversation hasn't fully resolved the differences. It's a subtle moment, but an important one. It shows that the discussion remains respectful and grounded. As the segment continues, the hosts begin to transition the conversation once again, this time toward how these broader themes connect to Priyanka's work and public image. The shift feels natural, but the impact of the earlier exchange lingers. The audience is still attentive, more engaged now than at the beginning of the segment. What started as a routine interview has clearly evolved into something more reflective, shaped by thoughtful questions, careful answers, and a steady, realistic tension that never crosses into confrontation. And as the discussion moves forward, it becomes clear that both Priyanka and Whoopi are navigating the conversation with intention, balancing honesty with respect, and allowing the moment to unfold in a way that feels authentic to the format of live daytime television. As the segment continues, the conversation begins to widen slightly, moving from personal perspective into how those ideas play out in real situations. The earlier exchange between Priyanka Chopra and Whoopi Goldberg has clearly shaped the tone of the discussion on The View, and now the rest of the panel leans in more actively, contributing in ways that reflect both curiosity and an effort to keep the conversation balanced. One of the co-hosts introduces a slightly more practical angle, asking how these expectations from the public and media have influenced the kinds of roles Priyanka chooses or the projects she decides to be part of. The question feels like a natural extension, connecting the broader conversation about responsibility to her actual career decisions. Priyanka responds with the same composed demeanor she has maintained throughout. She explains that while she's aware of how her choices might be perceived, she ultimately tries to focus on stories that resonate with her personally. She mentions that representation is important, but she doesn't approach every decision as a statement. Instead, she looks for roles that feel authentic and meaningful to her as an artist. As she speaks, her tone softens slightly compared to earlier, suggesting that she's now in more familiar territory. The audience seems to relax a bit as well, with a few quiet nods and a lighter energy returning to the room. However, Whoopi follows up with a question that gently brings the conversation back into that more serious space. She asks whether there's ever a concern that certain choices, whether roles or public statements, might be interpreted in ways that she didn't intend, especially given her visibility across different cultures. The question isn't confrontational, but it carries a similar weight to her earlier points. It signals that while the conversation has shifted, the underlying theme hasn't gone away. Priyanka acknowledges that concern, nodding slightly before answering. She explains that interpretation is something she has learned to expect, and that it's not always within her control. Her voice remains steady, but there's a quiet emphasis when she says that she focuses on intention rather than reaction. She adds that trying to anticipate every possible interpretation would make it difficult to make any decision at all. The audience listens closely, and there's a sense that this is one of the more relatable parts of the conversation, not just for public figures, but for anyone navigating expectations. One of the co-hosts briefly steps in with a comment about how audiences often project their own experiences onto public figures, which can create misunderstandings. Her tone is reflective, and it helps to momentarily ease the intensity of the exchange. Whoopi nods at that, but she doesn't fully step away from her line of questioning. Instead, she reframes it slightly, sharing an observation from her own career. She notes that sometimes, even when intentions are clear, the impact can be very different, and that public figures often have to address that gap. There's a slight pause after she says this, and the room feels still again. It's not tense in an uncomfortable way, but it's focused. The kind of silence that happens when a point lands and everyone takes a moment to consider it. Priyanka responds carefully. She agrees that impact matters, and she doesn't dismiss that idea. Instead, she builds on it, explaining that recognizing impact is important, but it should also be paired with understanding context. She says that conversations should allow room for clarification, rather than immediate judgment. Her tone remains even, but there's a subtle firmness in her delivery, suggesting that this is an area she feels strongly about. The audience remains attentive, and a few heads nod in agreement. At this point, the dynamic between her and Whoopi feels more like a thoughtful exchange than a back and forth with opposing sides. They aren't repeating the same points, but rather adding layers to the discussion. Another co-host joins in, offering a perspective that bridges the two viewpoints. She suggests that perhaps the real challenge lies in how quickly audiences form opinions, especially in a media environment where information moves rapidly. Her comment brings a small murmur of agreement from the audience, and the tone of the segment begins to soften again. Priyanka nods in response, adding that she believes conversations like this are important precisely because they allow for nuance. She mentions that in many cases, there isn't a simple answer, and that acknowledging complexity is a step toward better understanding. Whoopi listens, her expression more relaxed now. When she responds, her tone shifts slightly, less probing, more reflective. She acknowledges that nuance is often lost in fast-paced discussions, especially in public spaces. It's a subtle moment of alignment, even if their approaches remain different. The audience responds with a light round of applause, recognizing that the conversation has reached a more balanced place. It's not a resolution in the traditional sense, but it feels like progress. As the segment begins to move toward its later moments, the hosts start to gently guide the conversation toward a closing direction. One of them brings the focus back to Priyanka's current work, asking about what she hopes audiences take away from her projects moving forward. Priyanka answers with a calm confidence, explaining that she hopes her work can contribute to a broader understanding of different stories and perspectives. She emphasizes that storytelling has the power to connect people, and that this is what motivates her most. Her tone here is lighter again, though still grounded, and it signals a gradual transition away from the more intense part of the discussion. Whoopi responds with a brief acknowledgement, offering a small smile and a nod. It's a quiet gesture, but it reflects a level of mutual respect that has remained consistent throughout the exchange. The audience reacts positively, with a warmer round of applause this time. The energy in the studio feels more settled, as if the earlier tension has been absorbed into a more thoughtful atmosphere. Even as the conversation shifts back toward a more traditional interview format, the impact of what was discussed lingers. The pacing remains slightly slower, the responses more measured, and the engagement from both the panel and the audience more attentive than it was at the beginning. And as the segment approaches its conclusion, it's clear that what unfolded wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but rather a realistic, layered discussion. One that reflects how live television can sometimes move beyond surface-level conversation into something more meaningful, shaped by perspective, experience, and a willingness to engage thoughtfully in the moment. As the conversation begins to wind down, there's a noticeable shift in pacing across the table on The View. The earlier intensity has eased, replaced by a more reflective tone that often marks the final moments of a segment like this. The hosts subtly adjust their posture, and the rhythm of the discussion becomes more measured, signaling that the show is preparing to transition. Priyanka Chopra remains composed, her expression calm, while Whoopi Goldberg looks toward her with a thoughtful nod. There's no abrupt conclusion to their exchange. Rather, it tapers naturally, the way conversations often do when both sides have had the opportunity to express their perspectives. One of the co-hosts steps in with a closing-style question, bringing the focus back to Priyanka's current work and what lies ahead. The shift feels intentional, giving the audience a sense of resolution after a discussion that explored deeper themes. Priyanka answers with a steady, confident tone, speaking about upcoming projects and her continued interest in telling stories that cross cultural boundaries. Her response is concise compared to earlier answers, but still thoughtful. She emphasizes the importance of connection through storytelling, something she has returned to more than once during the segment. As she speaks, the audience begins to relax again, and the atmosphere in the studio feels lighter. Whoopi follows with a brief closing remark of her own. She thanks Priyanka for being open and for engaging in a conversation that went beyond the usual promotional topics. Her tone is warm, and there's a sense of mutual respect in how she frames it. It's not a dramatic reconciliation, because there was no real conflict to resolve, but it acknowledges the depth of what was discussed. Priyanka responds with a small smile and a nod, thanking the panel for the conversation. The exchange is simple, but it carries a sense of closure. The audience reacts with a round of applause, this time more sustained, reflecting appreciation not just for the guest, but for the discussion itself. As the segment officially ends and the show transitions toward a commercial break, the energy in the studio shifts once again. The applause fades, and the hosts begin their usual off-script interactions, exchanging a few quick comments as the cameras pull back slightly. For viewers at home, it's a familiar moment, the transition that signals the end of one segment and the start of another. But even as the show moves on, the conversation lingers. Shortly after the episode airs, viewers begin sharing their reactions across social media. Many highlight the exchange between Priyanka and Whoopi as one of the more thoughtful moments of the show. Some viewers express appreciation for Priyanka's emphasis on intentional communication, noting that her perspective reflects the complexities of navigating a global platform. Others focus on Whoopi's points, agreeing that public figures often carry a level of responsibility that extends beyond personal choice. These reactions don't necessarily contradict each other. Instead, they reflect the same balance that was present during the conversation itself. Clips from the segment begin circulating online, particularly the moments where the discussion slowed and both perspectives were clearly articulated. Viewers comment on the respectful tone of the exchange, pointing out that it's rare to see differing viewpoints explored without interruption or escalation. In follow-up discussions, both online and in media coverage, the segment is often described as an example of how daytime television can handle nuanced topics. Rather than framing it as a disagreement, many describe it as a conversation that allowed for multiple perspectives to coexist. There are also viewers who note how the rest of the panel contributed to maintaining that balance. The co-host's efforts to guide the discussion, to step in when needed, and to allow space for both Priyanka and Whoopi to speak are recognized as part of what kept the segment grounded. In the days following the broadcast, brief clarifications and reflections appear in interviews and social media posts. Priyanka reiterates her belief in thoughtful engagement, emphasizing that her approach is shaped by experience rather than avoidance. Her comments align closely with what she expressed during the show, reinforcing the consistency of her message. Whoopi, in her own remarks, reflects on the importance of dialogue, noting that conversations like the one they had are necessary for understanding different perspectives. She doesn't revisit specific points in detail, but her tone suggests that she values the exchange as part of a broader conversation. Back on the show, the segment is occasionally referenced in later episodes, usually in passing, as part of ongoing discussions about public responsibility and media influence. It's not revisited as a controversy, but rather as a moment that contributed to a larger, continuing dialogue. For the audience, the lasting impression is not of conflict, but of contrast. Two perspectives presented clearly, respectfully, and without unnecessary escalation. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't demand a winner or a resolution, but instead invites viewers to consider where they stand. And that's often what makes moments like this memorable. As the clip continues to circulate and discussions evolve, one thing remains consistent: the recognition that what unfolded was real in the way live television sometimes is. Unscripted, thoughtful, and shaped by the people involved in the moment. If you watched that exchange, or if you've seen the reactions since, you've probably formed your own opinion on what was said and how it was handled. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.